short period of time, been able to reverse aspects of our legislation that literally choked us and denied us the dignity of agency and the dignity of our humanity is a major, major accomplishment. In our case, it cut across many leaders. In yours, it did. But some of these things stand out purely because of the majesty of the legislative transformation and the social transformation. The repealing of the Master and Servants Act, an iniquitous piece of legislation that sought to bind us in as close to bonds of slavery without slavery being legal. The establishment of a national minimum wage, something that eluded many, many countries for many, many decades before you established it here. Maternity leave with pay, which we actually did slightly before you, but Michael Manley made sure that you did it. Gender equity and pay scales. Other laws, as we heard tonight, that outlawed bastardy, as we did too, around the same time. A law that established your National Housing Trust, I'm told, that transformed the fate of so many of your citizens. But it is not simply in the announcement and the passage and the recitation of these policies that it matters. It is also in the essence of the man, believing that fundamental to the building of a society is the dignity to be accorded to each and every citizen, to see, hear, and feel each and every citizen. And we take this sometimes for granted because the world in which we live doesn't even admit of it. Countries that are large sometimes don't see or feel small countries. The reality is that it is a rare, rare virtue. And for the last 6 years, I started to reflect on how much the world looked like 100 years ago. And that in truth and in fact, we are in the throes of an inflection point, a historic movement that really, really, today, causes us to have to pause. And the danger is that we might be at risk of being distracted from the fundamental things that truly make a difference to our planet and to our people, and by extension, to our Caribbean civilization. The reality is that what we are witnessing, in my view, is really the dying of an old order without yet seeing where the new order will be located and how it will be framed. The Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci wrote in his famous prison notebooks, and I quote, "The old world is dying, and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters," unquote. And what are those monsters today? Is it the climate crisis? I don't refer to it as climate change because there's nothing about change in the crisis that we face. It is a season of superlatives, and it's the season of the unexpected. We see it from the droughts, to the floods, to the hurricanes, to the sargassum seaweed, to so many other things that are so unrealistic. I'm accustomed to convection rain here in Kingston, not in Bridgetown. For the last 2 years, we experienced that from August to December, almost 5 days a week. While at the same time, for the first 6 months of last year, we had less than 50% rainfall of the average 30 years that went before, in the same year. The monsters are the pandemics. And we acknowledge that with the increased heat, we are likely to see new pathogens develop, and by extension, new pandemics are likely to emerge. But even as we speak, separate from that, our abuse of antibiotics, antimicrobials, has led to an extraordinary level of antimicrobial resistance that now makes that responsible for the third highest number of deaths directly and indirectly in the world, and by 2050 it shall be responsible for the highest volume of deaths in the world, reversing a century of medical progress and making simple things like going to the dentist or going in the garden or having a baby risky things if you get an infection. We have seen environmental degradation generally, but in particular degradation of our soils. And there is the belief that it will considerably impact the already threatened food security that we have as a result of the impact of climate itself. But soil degradation in and of itself will make it worse. We are seeing the collapse of ecosystems and the collapse of and further loss of biodiversity. Things that we were accustomed to seeing are finding themselves removed from our environment. And at the same time, globally, we have 35 million people, refugees, across the world, fleeing wars, violence, persecution, and abject poverty, right here in our own region to across the world. The world itself is a dangerous place to be. The 1st of December, France had a government, as did Syria. Today, the 10th of December, both have been gone for a few days. One by law and one by force. We are at an interesting point. We hear of the movement against incumbents more than anything else. Some of it expresses itself in right-wing populism, some of it in the UK, left of center. But in both instances, it's an anti-incumbent move, largely because much of what people have had to experience in this polycrisis moment in the last 5 years has made life difficult for most and perplexing for all. The spectacle of fake news and the inability to control a narrative to build a nation, where broadcasting used to be the order of the day and now narrowcasting and echo chambers replace it. We have more than ever to determine what does love look like in this, the third decade of the 21st century. And because time limits me, I'll just address a few matters. One, as it relates to regional integration and foreign policy. Two, as it relates to the reform of the international financial system, and by extension our capacity to meet the global public goods that are critical for our survival on the planet as people. And finally, the utter and absolute importance as Caribbean people of the psychological reinforcement of our cultural identity to give us purpose and to give us unity and solidarity to weather these difficult times as the New World Order finds itself emerging. May not be for a few decades, maybe as soon as the next 5-10 years. And it is slow upon us when all of a sudden, as we saw in Syria, it is immediately upon us. And that is the nature of the world in which we live today, where the powers that influence and the information that is generated goes way beyond the nation state. And to that extent, on this day of International Human Rights Day, one asks yourself, what will that new world order look like? And what will truly be the power of nation states? Will small states be able to survive without deep functional cooperation and pooling? Or will they become collateral victims as the world seeks to line up behind great powers yet again, particularly if the multilateral rules-based system that we have is not allowed to work for us? I say to you that it is critical that we not be sucked in to the bankruptcy of the current global world order. And if we go back to what love was for Michael Manley, and I'm amazed at the extent to which even the language used foretold the times in which we come to live in. There is no doubt that we are in a race against time, and those who doubt it will fail to prepare. And that, for us, means that we recognize that love fundamentally is about caring, seeing, hearing, and feeling. Fundamentally is about resilience, a word that Michael used more ahead of his time than most. And love is about transformation. We have taken long to do some of these things, not because of laziness, but because of the complexity of the root system that has caused us to be victims of another order that effectively took away from us identity and movement. And I dare say that so fundamental is the human resistance against that type of activity that I really believe that that is one of the reasons for the strong anti-incumbent movement globally, coming after 2 to 3 years of restricted movement and increased cost of living, where persons are trying to recoup losses in the shortest possible time from a pandemic, that has caused people to say, hey, you didn't see me for a few years, but watch me now, I'm here. And if you don't realize I'm here, I'm going to show you that I'm here. And we've seen it country by country by country by country. But if we come to understanding what that race to become resilient must look like, it is being thrown at us more than ever through the climate crisis. And that is why, in a very real sense, the global south, in its victimhood, has a renewed sense of solidarity, because we all know that we didn't cause the problem, and that in fact we are now bearing double jeopardy, because having been the beast of burden to enrich those who built the Industrial Revolution, we are now the first victims on the front line to the consequences of the Industrial Revolution in terms of greenhouse warming. And that solidarity is not in a vacuum, because at the same time that we seek to save ourselves from the climate crisis, you're asking us to divert critical capacity and financing away from the noble objectives of development as best captured in the Sustainable Development Goals. It is not on. And we can no longer move in one direction to fight climate, then we can move in the other direction alone to fight development and ignore climate. We must walk and chew. And it is a false dichotomy to ask people to choose between people and planet. The foreign policy, therefore, that we have has first and foremost today to reinforce that effort that Michael Manley brought to bear in bringing unity among the global south, the former colonies, to be able to define a policy and fiscal space that was sufficiently large to pursue the policies that would empower and enrich our people and accord to them the dignity that has always been theirs, but was robbed because of the iniquitous institutions of slavery and colonialism and imperialism. We have, at this point, to recognize that that common purpose, and I have the honor to lead now the climate vulnerable countries of the world, otherwise known as the V20 group, which now embraces 70 countries from across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean and Latin America. Recognizing that our common purpose in fighting the battles against the climate crisis and finding the financing necessary to secure our way, and also conscious of the pathogens that may develop, because health can immediately trump anything if a pandemic hits us in the way that the last one did. These countries are no more different from the countries Michael Manley dealt with 50 years ago, but with few voices listening and few countries feeling. Mark Golden spoke earlier, and Prime Minister Patterson, about some of the common challenges. And the truth is that as we speak, we might have been the canaries in the mine, but the climate crisis has now literally crept in to the reality of the lives of those in the global north. Whether it is the wildfires in California and Canada and Europe, or it is the floods or the hurricanes, there is no part of Earth that is being exempt from it. And if we don't recognize that our primary purpose and gaze must be to fight this battle unless some people have a plan to live on Mars that we don't know about, then we will lose the battle. The reality is that there are diverging views, and we must take the world as we find it, not as we dream for. And if we are to do so, and I don't normally disagree with Prime Minister Patterson, I'm not trying to school the President-elect, but I'm conscious that while we may disagree as to the causes of the climate, we cannot disagree as to the reality of disaster. And in a very real sense, our love of planet requires of us to have mature conversations that may respect the differences of what brings us to each point, but to find the commonalities for progress to be achieved, because the climate crisis is not waiting on any of us as it unleashes its furor on the world. Against that backdrop, I have said recently and repeat that if there is a way to warp size the research for the commercial application of decarbonizing technology on the fossil fuel industry, bring it on, because that's what we need. And I don't say so tongue-in-cheek, because I'm conscious that there are many countries in the Caribbean now and in Africa whose capacity to finance their development was premised and may still be premised on the fossil fuel industries. But the reality is that if we want that to help be part of the equation, then we need to make sure that the technology that will decarbonize the emissions is in fact applied at commercial scale. And there are aspects of it out there, just not yet rigorous enough. And in the same way that we saw the warp speed with the vaccine research in the pandemic, that is the kind of approach that we now need with respect to the technology. Similarly, we need a global agreement on methane. Methane has 80 times the negative consequences of carbon. Carbon, however, stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, whereas methane originally and by itself, will leave after 12 years. How do we do it? Every time a company flares gas, it is losing money and it is hurting the atmosphere. Every time you fail to fix a gas leak in your pipelines, you are doing the same. So let us have an agreement. Make more money by stopping the flaring and fixing the leaks, and at the same time save the atmosphere and the environment from the negative impact of methane gas. Change the manner in which we pursue livestock farming and rice paddy farming, as is beginning to happen. And let us find new practices to inform waste management in our various countries. The reality is that if we do that, the scientists tell us we can actually reverse the temperature by 0.5 degrees, rather than seeing the continued forging onward. And therefore, if we can, while disagreeing on the causes of the climate crisis, meet to discuss progress on just those two areas without prejudice to the conversation that we must have, and I'm coming to that, on the financing of global public goods, then I truly believe that we will not waste our time in the next few years. We don't need to agree on every single thing to make.
Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am Michelle, and if you're watching me for the first time, remember to like, share and subscribe. In today's clip, we're going to talk about Mia Mottley. Mia Mottley is the Prime Minister of Barbados. Mia Mottley is our leader who advises Caribbean countries and African countries to unite. Mia Mottley is that one leader who addresses the truth and points out leaders who are greedy and who are corrupt without any fear. She is a confident leader. She is admired by women, including me. I admire that woman very much. Mia Mottley is a woman who shows one of the good characteristics of a good leader. Mia Mottley advises African countries and Caribbean countries to never forget their ancestral background and always unite. Mia Mottley also advises Caribbean countries and Africans to never discriminate each other and love each other as brothers and sisters. Mia Mottley is that one leader who always appreciates black people, always wants black people to be together as one. One of the good reason about this woman, she's one of the most good, she's a woman leader, but it's mad some male leaders, which is a good, she works as a good example. A lot of people really admire that woman. She's showing a good example to young people who are growing and people who are grown-ups. She has the qualities of a good leader. She's loved and doesn't show. She shows people what kind of a leader people should be. She shows people that corruption and leadership doesn't go hand in hand. Guys, if it was for the first time coming across this video, remember to like, share and subscribe.